Good evening, everyone. As Todd said, I work for the facilities department where I am primarily responsible for all of our physical records of the campus going back 80, 90 years. I'm also working on projects to map the subsurface, figure out where everything is on campus, and help everybody who's doing work around campus figure out what's supposed to be below the ground before they dig it up. This is a lot more relevant than you might expect. This past summer, when we were digging over behind Huntington Hall, between Huntington and Sherman, we ran into this massive concrete base of a wall that no one knew was there. It had been built in the 1960s, it had been partially torn out in the 70s and buried. When we came along to do a project, we had to jackhammer our way through it. It took a couple days to get through it. So this is the kind of thing that we're dealing with on a pretty regular basis. We in facilities are stewards in the classic sense. A steward was always a person who acted as an agent for a landowner or for a property owner. This campus is property of the people of the state of New York. It's what it says on all the documents and all of our forms that we have. And you are the people of the state of New York, and you're also our clients because you're here as students. So we are certainly acting as stewards in an effort to use all of our resources to maintain the campus, improve it where we can, and then hopefully when we get to retire, hand it off to a new generation of people who will continue to maintain it as we go along. I came here, as Todd said, as an 18-year-old freshman in 1983. Yeah, that's me, 18 years old, bad beard, the whole 9 yards. Right down in Blodgett Hall. I can hardly believe that 32 years has gone by since I first came here to campus. And I think that if you told that guy that he was going to still be here 32 years later, he would have been extremely horrified. But I'm really happy doing what I'm doing. I really enjoy it. It really gets to me because I can solve problems, I can help people on campus, I get to indulge in my passion for history, and that's one of the things I'm going to talk about here tonight. Incidentally, when I was here as a student, this room was a bar. So the room that you're sitting in right now looked like this in about 1971. We'll come back to that sort of at the end of the presentation. Most people never really consider the environment they walk around in. They sort of see it, out of the corner of their eye. It's part of their subconscious. But they sort of regard it, if they regard it at all, as something that's sort of been here forever. You might see a cornerstone. This is 1931. You might see a fallout shelter sign, and some of you are old enough to remember what that means, and some of you aren't. But it's sort of just part of the background noise of what you walk around in, and you never really consider where it all came from, or more importantly, what was here before. This is the campus that we all know and love, taken from a very high altitude on a beautiful summer afternoon a couple of years ago. Up at the top, you can see the Hunt Union next to the pond with the athletic fields right above it. That's what it looked like 85 years ago. If you were sitting in this spot 85 years ago, you'd be sitting on the edge of this pond, because it was here, and the pond has another whole story that I won't go into right now. But across the pond was a thick forest made out of oaks, maples, elm trees, which are now gone, chestnuts, all kinds of very old growth, very large trees. That was sort of an unusual thing even for that time, 85 years ago. The area all around this had been cut clear. Starting back in the 19th and 18th centuries, people started cutting down the trees because they needed the wood. They wanted to clear the land for farming. And when the advent of the railroad came to Oneonta in 1869, the process just accelerated. So by the turn of the century, most of the trees were gone, except for this area right here. This area was at the north end of the city, and there were a lot of wealthy landowners who owned the parcels of land up here, and I imagine that they were hoping that the city would continue to grow and that their investment in land would pay very large dividends. It didn't really work out that way. Which is a good thing for us because this is now where the campus is. Here's a close-up of the same site. Okay, the pond just had a bunch of little paths around it. This little pathway right here is the future course of Bugby Road, right out here. But this pond was pretty much here for, probably hundreds and thousands of years until it was expanded and made a little larger as part of the campus development. It pretty much remained this way until about the 1960s. In 1940, the campus consisted of a grand total of 2 buildings. Bugby to the left, which is still there, and Old Main to the right, which is not. This is a photograph of some probably freshman or sophomore walking around campus getting a look at things, and you can see even in those days, we were digging things up. This is when they were building, actually, they're getting ready to build some of the dorms, the first-year experience dorms in the 1940s and 50s. By the late 1950s, the post-war prosperity, the GI Bill, the growth of the need for education had made the campus grow to about 7 or 8 buildings, and it had expanded. You can see right here, it's a little hard to see, but that's the heating plant with a 145-foot tall chimney out back because they burned coal, okay, which we would not do today to heat our campus. Incidentally, all of the dormitories, all the residence halls that we have here on campus still have the incinerators in them that were used to burn garbage way back in the beginning. And I say back in the beginning, this would have been 1950s and 60s. Obviously, we don't do that anymore either. So here's the campus as it was probably about 1962 or so. Golding is just going up right here, which was the last of the first-year experience buildings. And then the baby boom came. In the 1960s, everybody wanted to go to college. There were hundreds and hundreds of thousands of young people who wanted to go to college, and the state responded by vastly expanding the campus. They built 30 more buildings during the 1960s, 11 in one 3-year period. And when they did that, you can see that they didn't pay a whole heck of a lot of attention to the forest that used to be here. They came in with giant bulldozers and roam plows and chainsaws and you name it, and they made a clean sweep of it because that was how it was approached back then. You wanted to have a clean start. You wanted to remake the landscape in some sort of aesthetic image that they had at the time. And that didn't include incorporating the old wetlands, the old forest, the old topography. They changed everything, okay? Just plowed it right up. And then they came and planted trees. Apparently, the old trees weren't good enough, so they came in and planted regimented rows of small saplings that all looked exactly the same, and most of which did not survive. So this was the approach that was taken to developing the campus at the time. It really is unfortunate, but I didn't come here to lament this lost forest. I came here to talk to you tonight about 3 survivors of the forest that used to stand here, and 3 trees that you can see tomorrow morning when you get up and it's light out. You can go take a walk around. The first one stands right out in front of Wilbur Hall. If you go down the way and you go past Wilbur Hall, here's human ecology behind it. There's this magnificent old oak tree that stands here. That oak tree is about 150 to 200 years old. We had a gentleman come here from the DEC in Stamford, and he helped us take core samples from these trees, which involved pulling like a pencil-thin piece of wood out of the trunk of the tree, counting the rings, measuring how long it was, multiplying times the diameter of the tree, and getting a minimum age. So we're talking 150, maybe closer to 200, not really sure, but we'll go with 150. This tree, a view from above, you can see Wilbur right here. You can see the 2 trees right here. I've taken this and superimposed the photograph from 90 years ago. And 90 years ago, there was a little farm here in front of Wilbur. Here's a barn, here's a little house, a couple outbuildings, here's one tree, here's the other. And today, here's the superimposed outline of the campus on it. Here's Wilbur, here are the buildings, here's the one tree, and here's the other. So those trees were quite mature even in 1930, and they have now become 80 years older, and they were quite substantial even at that time. Now, these people who lived here in this building occupied this space in a way that is really radically different from what we have right now. I made a little overlay just to kind of show you what it would have been kind of like at the time. A little barn right here, a little farmhouse behind it, probably a chicken coop, maybe some other outbuildings. But there was a family that lived here. It was the Braden family. We know their name, don't know much more about them. They were here up until probably about 1940 or so. But, you know, they had a farm, they raised kids probably, they scratched out a living up here. They had a lot of successes probably, they had a lot of failures if they were like anybody else in the Depression. Incidentally, this is a little bit of an aside, right around the corner from this, come down the slope, you come to Lee Hall. And right next to Lee Hall is a pathway that runs down to the top of Elm Street, which is known as the Cow Path. Do you know why it's called the Cow Path? Because they actually ran their cows up and down that path when they were taking them to market and bringing them back up to their little farm. That was why it was called the cow path. That name originated way back in the 30s and 40s when the school was just starting to grow, and here we are. The next tree is also relatively easy to see. It's right down the slope below. This is the health center. Right down the slope down here is this little triangle of ground. You drive by it every time you come up the slope. It's pretty much been unchanged since forever. Okay, it was part of this chunk of trees that had never been logged, never been cut. The campus whittled away and whittled away and whittled away at the forest, but that little piece was left over. So as you're coming up the drive, here's the turn to West Storm Drive. Health Center's up here. You got these magnificent oak trees that are all sort of crammed together in this little area right here. And those also come in at about 150 to 200 years old. So these trees were standing here at the time of the Civil War. It has an impact on you when you go into that little piece of woods and you stand there and you can't, 2-3 people couldn't get their arms around this enormous tree that's been sitting here for 15 decades through countless storms, putting the leaves out in the spring, putting the acorns out in the fall, going through all of the droughts and all of the storms and watching, anthropomorphizing a little bit, but watching 50 or 60,000 freshmen come up that Ravine Parkway every year, as wide-eyed and as crazy as I was in 1983. Okay? Another really impressive tree. Now the third one is a lot more venerable and a lot more difficult to get to. This is a white pine tree that is standing in the ravine right behind the field house. Now this tree is about 140 feet tall, and it's kind of hard to tell when you go look at it because it's down in a deep ravine that the Silver Creek runs through, and it's crowded with a lot of other trees around it, so it's kind of difficult to see how tall it is. But this tree clocked in when we cored it at 260 years old. So this tree, that's a minimum. White pines can get to be 400 years old before they start to really lose their thing. But 260 years old puts it back at about 1760, 1770, give or take, okay? This tree is so large that in order to give you a sense of how big it is, I took an original drawing of the Hunt Union as viewed from across the pond, superimposed the photograph that I took, and then superimposed the drawing of this tree in front of it. So this tree that's down this ravine is twice as tall as this building. It's enormous. This photograph that I've got doesn't really do it justice, but it's really worth going to take a look at. Massive trunk at the bottom. It's been standing in that ravine because it's sheltered from the storm. It survived. It's got plenty of water, and probably most importantly, it's in a place where nobody wanted to use the land because the ground is like this, okay? So it's a wonderful old tree. You should really go down and take a look at it. Now, this tree has another story behind it that I want to tell you. This guy is probably the most influential New Yorker that you never heard of. This is Sir William Johnson. He came over from England in the 1760s and became, among other things, a land speculator in the New York colony. He got land grants given to him by the Crown. He did a lot of wheeling and dealing in lots of different ways. He was thought of at the time, and probably would be more so now, as quite a scoundrel. He had at least 3 wives. Innumerable mistresses and many illegitimate children. But he was the baronet that sort of lorded it over the whole colony of New York. Now, when you got a land grant back in those days, you got what was called a patent. You were given land by the Crown. This guy got 28,000 acres of land that occupied this valley, among many other holdings that totaled almost 200,000 acres. He got 28,000 acres of land here, and this was his patent that covers the place where Oneonta is right now. Okay, there were lots of other people who got patents around him. He got a lot of other land, and in order to get more, because it was always about getting more, right? He got 6 or 8 other guys to apply for a patent. They were given the land, and then he bought them out. Okay, it was really obviously a land scam, but that's what he did. And Oneonta is right there on the corner of that little line. We're right on the edge. And that patent line is still the boundary between the city and the town of Oneonta. Now, back when they had to survey this in 1770, the land surveyors came through and they were given orders to survey the land 1 mile on either side of the Susquehanna River. So that's what they did. And they established what were called patent line trees. They blazed the trees that were prominent along that line, and that's what one of these trees is, because that line goes right through the middle of campus, goes right across the ravine, and out down towards where the Indian village of Unadilla was back in those days. So I want you to consider this tree for a moment. This tree grew in what was clearly a pre-industrial age. Okay? Chemistry, physics, astronomy, medicine, very much in their infancy. Okay? It was a time when the 5th largest continent on Earth, Antarctica, wasn't even known. There were only 6 known planets. The 7th, 8th, and sort of 9th ones hadn't been discovered yet. This tree has been around for a long, long time. There was only 15,000 people living in New York City when this tree started growing. That's the same number of people as in Oneonta right now. That was a long time ago. At that time, it would take you 10 weeks to sail from England to New York. Women had no legal rights. They couldn't own property, they couldn't earn their own wages and keep them. Of course, they couldn't vote. They could not enter into legal contracts. And slavery, even though it was legal in New York colonies, wasn't terribly widespread, but it was here and would be for another 50 years, as well as lots of other kinds of indentured servitude. So this tree's been through a lot. This was at a time when 28,000 acres could be granted with the stroke of a pen because everybody thought that the North American continent was full of limitless resources. And at the time, it certainly seemed like it. And that idea persisted for centuries until my lifetime. In my lifetime, we've bumped up against the limits of those resources, and now we understand that that time has run out. And this tree is a good allegory for that. You can go down there and you can stand next to this tree, put your hand on it, and you can really feel the weight of time in it. It started growing at a time where if you wanted to get in touch with somebody, you either had to go see them in person, or you could send them a letter, and it might take 6 months or maybe never to get a response back. Today you can go down there, spend time with this tree, whip out your smartphone, call anybody on the planet and talk to them about it, as well as have access to the accumulated wisdom and folly of the whole human race. It's really a radical, different world that we live in from when this tree began growing. It goes without saying that we ought to preserve these trees. They represent a link to a vastly different time. It puts us in a continuum, a chain of being from person to person and place to place and time to time that you really can't get anywhere else in our modern world. This tree has seen almost 100,000 mornings and 100,000 nightfalls. You and I would be lucky to get even 1/3 of that in our lifetimes. I can't argue for the absolute value of these trees. I mean, this country is rapidly reforesting, especially in New York State. We have more forests now than we ever did before. But it's a reminder that a whole forest of trees lived here once. And the question immediately arises, was it right to bulldoze them for the greater good of creating a university? These are the kinds of questions that don't really have definite answers, but they're the kinds of things that we need to think about when it comes to the idea of stewardship, sustainability, and reasonable practical growth. I don't think that you can have any basis for acting as a steward for anything unless you know what came before. Because stewardship is really an obligation both to the past and to the future. And in order to live up to that obligation, you have to know what came before you can make any decent decisions about what's going to come next. And as Faulkner said in a radically different context, the past is never dead, it's not even past. And that's true. And especially when you go spend time with old things, you get to come to the realization that the things that are around you that come from a long time ago put you in touch with a space that you're not used to being in, because we all have grown up and live in a time when it's all about now, what's new, and you don't have any time to stop and think about what came before and what that means for what's going to come after. I'm going to give you a little more concrete example of that to kind of wrap up. Just going to pass through that. Here we are back at this photograph that was taken in this room about 45 years ago. It was an old black and white photograph. It was kind of dim in here like it is now. It probably required, a long exposure time, which we don't have to deal with anymore, because we whip out our cell phones and go click. So you get a lot of blurriness because people were in motion, okay? It was an active bar scene. I want you to look at some close-ups, a couple of close-ups of this, just to give you a sense of what I'm talking about here. Here's these people sitting in this corner. It's kind of hard to see because it's a little washed out here, but they're drinking cups of beer. There's a pack of Marlboro cigarettes and an ashtray right here. different times, right? But they were sitting right where you are. They're right there. And in a kind of a philosophical sense, they're there. Okay, these people are there. It immediately starts you thinking, what were they thinking about? What were they laughing about? What were their hopes for the future? And how did things turn out? Way in the back corner, there's another couple sitting back there. They're obviously sharing an intimate moment. She's sort of been moving a little bit, so she's a little bit blurred, but he's a little more in focus. You know, they were obviously close. What were they talking about? How did things turn out? Where are they? They were right there, back where they're sitting. Okay, right over there. And it's that kind of context, if you can put yourself in a space, and it can be something of very trivial history. This is not like the Battle of Gettysburg or the French Revolution or something like that. This is a very trivial, everyday scene, but it's a little teeny window into the past. And once you look into the past, you start reflecting back and then into your future. We talked about 1970, we talked about 1770. What are things going to be like in 2060 or in 2275? Because that's the same distance in the other direction. I might live to see 2260. You certainly will, but I sure as heck am not going to be here in 2275. It's my obligation as a member of the human race to create a situation where we can be stewards of what we have, hopefully make it better, pass it on to the next generation, because that's what we're really here for. The act of stewarding is to make your place in this continuum. Go see these trees. Go down there, spend some time with them, rest in their shade. They'll teach you a lot about sustainability. Thank you.